is the hub of global diplomacy. As G20 president, India is hosting the foreign ministers of the G20, the top diplomats of the world's 20 biggest economies. Some of them are allies, others arch rivals. The day began with handshakes. Let me show you some pictures. These are the foreign ministers of the US, Russia and China. They're all in Delhi shaking hands with their Indian counterpart, Dr. S. Jaishankar. They're at war in Ukraine, but attending talks in India. It is a big deal. Prime Minister Modi made a personal appeal for consensus today, but it fell on deaf ears, it seems. There is no consensus. Russia and America came face to face. They talked at each other. So after a long day of hard diplomacy, you can say the results were mixed. In the next few minutes, we'll try to sum it up for you. Let's start with the foreign ministers' meeting. It's the second event under India's G20 presidency, and the scale of this was truly massive. This was one of the largest gatherings of G20 foreign ministers. In all, as many as 40 delegations were invited. You had the foreign ministers of the G20, which is the first half. But who were the second half, the other 20? With its presidency, India is trying to give a voice to the underrepresented. Leaders from ASEAN nations were invited for this event. Some of India's immediate neighbors like Bangladesh were invited, also Mauritius. The G20 is also giving the hospitality sector in India a minor boost. All five-star hotels in central Delhi are fully booked this week. Now let's talk about what happened at the meetings. The first event was in Bengaluru, the finance ministers' meeting. It happened last month. It ended without a consensus, no joint statement. What about the meeting in New Delhi, the foreign ministers' meeting? The result was the same. There was no joint statement today.
There were issues, and I think the issues, I would say, very frankly, concerned the Ukraine conflict, on which there were divergences. So on the bulk of the issues, we were able to get an outcome document. There was a chair summary because there were differences on the Ukraine issue which we could not reconcile between various parties who held differing positions.
The meeting was presided over by India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. He began the proceedings by observing a minute's silence. This was for the victims of the devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Then Prime Minister Modi made a speech. He spoke candidly. He said, multilateralism is in crisis. And the global governance system has failed on two important fronts. Number one, preventing global wars, and number two, international cooperation. The Prime Minister also brought up the global South. He said India's presidency is giving a voice to it. In the end, he made an appeal. He asked the G20 foreign ministers to set aside their differences and build consensus on common goals.
You are meeting at a time of deep global divisions. As foreign minister, it is but natural that your discussions are affected by the geopolitical tensions of the day. We all have our positions and our perspectives on how this tension should be resolved. However, as the leading economies of the world, we also have a responsibility toward those who are not in this room. The world looks upon the G20 to ease the challenges of growth, development, economic resilience, disaster resilience, financial stability, transnational crime, corruption, terrorism, and food and energy security.
Prime Minister Modi's approach has won him praises. The Italian Prime Minister is in town too. Giorgia Meloni said Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India is the most loved leader.
I firmly believe that there's a lot that we can do together, and I'm not sure if this will lead me to the approval rate that the Prime Minister Modi has reached. I think he's the most loved one of all around the world. But I mean, this has really proven that he has been a major leader, and congratulations for that, Prime Minister.
Now, as G20 president, India has set out clear priorities. The focus is on the developing world and its urgent needs like dealing with climate change, the increasing burden of debt, digital transformation, rising inflation, and food and energy security. These issues impact every government and their citizens. Surely the G20 could have done to build consensus here, but the war in Ukraine has come in the way. The G20 is not being able to look beyond the conflict. Sample this. There was no family photo of the G20 meeting. A family photo is when all the leaders attending the meeting come together for a click. But leaders of the G7, the US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan were not on board. They do not want to share the frame with the Russians, so no photo. And this is the second time they're doing this. There was no family photo in the Bali meet last year either. Many ministers did not make it for the inaugural dinner yesterday, apparently in an attempt to limit their engagements with Russia. So the war in Ukraine will cast a shadow on these events. Today, the top diplomats of the US and Russia were in the same room for the first time in almost a year. The daggers were drawn. America's Blinken tried to rally more support for Ukraine. Russia's Lavrov tried to mount a counterattack.
End this war of aggression. Engage in meaningful diplomacy that can produce a just and durable peace. President Zelensky has put forward a 10-point plan for a just and durable peace. The United States stand ready to support Ukraine through diplomacy to end the war on this basis. President Putin, however, has demonstrated zero interest in engaging, saying there's nothing to even talk about unless and until Ukraine accepts, and I quote, the new territorial realities.
By posing, making a lot of rhetorical statements, they wanted to put at the forefront the problem, the situation around Ukraine, which they present under the guise of the so-called Russian aggression. It did not yield anything good. The discussion, at least in regards of the Western countries' speeches, the G7 countries, they were getting very emotional in their statements, and it all was damaging the normal process of discussing the issues that are really important for the G20 agenda.
Their fight continued behind the cameras too. Reports say Blinken and Lavrov met each other. It wasn't a scheduled interaction. The leaders spoke briefly to each other. This is their first one-on-one interaction since the war in Ukraine began. And what was discussed? Blinken is said to have made 3 points to Lavrov. Number one, the US will continue to support Ukraine. Number two, Russia should rejoin the New START treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START. It's a pact about nuclear weapons. The US and Russia are both signatories. They have the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. The treaty is designed to restrict deployment of nukes by each side, but last month, Russian President Putin decided to suspend his country's participation. Blinken told Lavrov that Russia should join again. And his third message was this: the US wants Russia to release Paul Whelan. He's an American citizen imprisoned in Russia. He's an American Marine. He faces charges of spying. He was arrested in 2018 and is currently serving a 16-year jail sentence. This was America's message. 3 points. What about Russia? What did Lavrov say? What was his reaction? The Russian foreign minister was scathing in his attacks. He accused Western diplomats of derailing the meeting in an effort to scapegoat Russia. Lavrov presented his criticism in the form of an apology to India. Allow me to quote from what he said. I want to apologize to the Indian presidency and to our colleagues from countries of the global south for the obscene behavior of some Western delegations, which have turned the G20's agenda into a farce. You see, India's goals for the G20 presidency are ambitious. Considering the differences, the task for the Indian diplomats is cut out. The war in Ukraine could derail India's agenda.